So as was already told to you, I went to Westmont College. I probably should say that kind of quietly. And I was a psychology major. I was not a theology major at the time, but my passion was theology. And so oftentimes I would ask some of these big life questions. And we'd stay up really late at night asking some of those questions like, does God predestine us or do we have free will? You know, should I be, am I going to be married or am I going to be single in life? Or some of those questions like, you know, can you be saved once you've given up your faith? Can you lose your faith? And so I'd ask some of those questions very late at night. We'd stay up in the dorm room talking about that. That's probably why I only had one date with the captain of the tennis team, because I just wanted to talk theology with him the whole night. And I think he'd rather talk about other things than that. So, but I want you to think about what are some of those pressing questions that keep you awake at night, that nag you, that don't let you sleep at night. So can you think about one of those questions you have? So I wanted to begin with that, to think about, I no longer have the leisure of time to spend asking whether predestination or free will exists, except for my job. But oftentimes I'm asking different kinds of questions, more practical questions like, you know, how can I be a godly mother? How can I be a godly professor? But they're all guided around the same core questions. And that really is, what is my purpose in life? You know, how does God really call me to interact and engage with him and with others? And as I ask some of those questions, the chief question I think we really should be asking is really, what is my purpose in life? What is my purpose in life? And two things that I've thought about as I've dwelled on that question in very, very different forms in my life. So early on in college, it was those questions of, what should my career be, right? Should I be a psychologist? Should I be an educator? I wasn't even thinking theology at that time in my life. And then as I got a little bit older, thinking about going into the career of theology. As a woman, going into a career of theology, what does God have planned for me with that? You know, I was told that I couldn't get a job if I studied theology. I probably couldn't get married because men wouldn't want to marry someone who had a degree in theology. So all those people who told me that, I have an awesome husband. So, but when I think about that question of revolving around what is our purpose of life, how does the Westminster Confession answer that question? Do you remember that? What is the chief aim of man? Can you say it with me? The chief and highest end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And that seems like a very basic answer to it. Maybe not so helpful for you right now, here in your position in life, because what does it mean actually to glorify God? I ultimately think that there's another question that I need to think about, and that's it. Is that really the right question to be asking? What is my chief end? And ultimately, isn't it about what is God's chief end? And I think so many years I've contemplated these questions and thought about them and thought about them and thought about them, and I've put all the focus on myself rather than putting my focus on God. So some of you might remember that Carly Simon song, I'm Dating Myself. He's so vain, he probably thinks the song is about him. You guys remember that one? I won't sing it for you, I'm musically challenged, but I could rewrite that song. I'm so vain, I think this life is all about me. And so often, that's where I focus. I focus on, what am I gonna do? What is my purpose? How am I gonna glorify God? Recognizing that really it should be flipped around, shouldn't it? Thinking about, how is God already glorious? And what is God's chief aim? And how am I part of that bigger story? And how is the church a part of that bigger story? How is Biola a part of that bigger story? And so really flipping that question on its head and saying, what is God's chief aim? And how would we answer that? We'd answer it very similarly to how we answered the first question, what is my chief aim? So what is God's chief aim? If we use that answer from the Westminster Confession, what would it be? His glory. That is his chief aim. And as I've been teaching my students about the character of God and the attributes of God, I've asked them that question, what is your top 5 list? What are those top 5 attributes like you reflect on and think about God? And what does that tell you about yourself? And thinking about how we really should image God and thinking and understand God is how God has revealed God's self. And how does God reveal God's self? As glorious and jealous over his glory being taken from him. And so thinking about that, how many Bible studies, lectures, sermons, and conversations have you had that has really been about God's glory? And there's a reason why. Because God's glory is so much bigger than we can ever comprehend. It's so much greater. We don't have any earthly comparable experience to the fullness of God's glory. And so when I was telling a friend what I was going to be speaking about this morning, he said to me, so what is God's glory anyways? And I began to go, oh, I actually have to talk about God's glory if I say I'm going to talk about it. And if I really want to talk about our chief aim is to reflect God's glory. And so I began to look in Scripture, look a little bit about what Scripture has to say about God's glory. Because where do we go to learn about God? We go to God's own self-revelation. We go to God's own word. So you see, no less than 77 times does it actually speak about God's glory. And so just looking at some of the passages that speak about God's glory, you can see in Deuteronomy 5:24, you said, behold, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and his greatness, and we have heard his voice from the midst of the fire. And we have seen today that God speaks with man, and yet he lives. Psalm 29:3, the voice of the Lord is upon the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord is over many waters. John 11:40, Jesus said to her, did I not say to you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? Acts 7:2, and he said, hear me, brethren and fathers. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. But however, even after reading all these passages, all 77 of them, I still didn't have a concise definition to give you guys. What does it mean for God to be glorious? What does it mean for God to have glory? So I began to look on the shoulders of some of our forefathers who've come before us, and I looked at Jonathan Edwards, one of my patron saints that I like to go to. And so he comes up with this definition. Let me read it to you. In the ultimate end for which God created the world, he describes God's glory on earth as the emanation and true external expression of God's internal glory and fullness. Some help, right? Aren't you told in first grade that you're not supposed to use the word to define the word? Right? So I'm like, oh, you're defining the word glory by glory. Why does he do that? Because there's nothing else on earth that can fully describe God's glory but God's glory. And so I continued to look at his definition a little bit further, but we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. And what I wanted to do was spend a little bit of time looking in the passage in Exodus 33 about what God reveals about God's self and his own glory. And so when we begin to look in Scripture, we see that God's glory includes everything about God. Everything about God. So in my class yesterday, we were trying to come up with what one attribute would come to the top. If you were going to have to pick what was the main attribute about God. And some people said love. Some people said holiness. Some people said, God's transcendence. We're coming up with different ideas. But really, when you look at Scripture and you understand God's holiness is really that emanation of all of those attributes about who God is. And so sometimes when some of you might consider yourself a Calvinist, you might say, well, sovereignty is really important to me. But really, when you read Jonathan Edwards, when you read John Calvin, they were all about God's glory. Sovereignty is connected with God's glory. So when we look at Exodus 33, we see this. The Lord said to Moses, "Depart, go up from here, and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt to the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it." Moses said to the Lord, "See, you say to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. Now therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I might know you in order to find favor in your sight. Consider too that this nation is your people." And the Lord said, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And Moses said to him, "If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, and I and your people? Is it not your going with us that we are distinct, and I and your people from every other people on the face of the earth?" And then the Lord said to Moses, "This very thing that you have spoken, I will do, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name." Moses said, "Please show me your glory." And he said, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy." But he said, "You cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." And the Lord said, "Behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock, and while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I pass by. And then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but you shall not see my face." Edwards reflects these 4 things about God's glory. Listen to these and see if you can pick these up from this passage. He says that God's glory has 4 dimensions in the end of creation, his work. He says, first, God in his very essence is glorious. God in his very essence is glorious. Sometimes as theologians, we call that God's transcendence. Secondly, he says, God's actions in creation are glorious. What do we call that as theologians? God's eminence, right? God's work on earth and in creation. Third, he says, God gave us the ability to perceive his glory and to worship him for it. So he sees a direct outpouring of recognizing God's glory as what? Worship. Third, he says, God gave us the ability to tell others about his glory. So that missional component to God's glory, that it isn't just for us to keep in, but it's for us to share and to spread to others. And I think what Edwards was doing was really reflecting on passages just like the one we just read, Exodus 33. So let's think that through for a minute. First of all, when you think about how he sees God's glory as in his transcendent nature, so think back to that passage, that God, in God's very essence, is glorious, which is even beyond our capacity to experience. God is so glorious that we cannot even be able to be in his full presence without what? Dying. When you think about, God actually shields Moses from himself because he's too glorious for Moses to experience and still live. And so he puts him in that cleft of the rock, he takes his hand and he covers his eyes. So God, in his very transcendent nature, is glorious. The second component, that eminent part of God, that God reveals to Moses that his very actions in creation are glorious. So the way God acts with his creation, even towards Moses in that picture, are glorious. And he tells Moses that he is what? Slow to anger, rich in unfailing love and faithfulness, forgiving, and also not leaving sins unpunished. So those are two things we probably wouldn't put together, right? God's love and faithfulness and not leaving sins unpunished. And yet God does in his character. And there's no contradiction in that. When he puts those two attributes together, they both, God's wrath, God's justice, God's whole being is glorious. It's not just those parts, those user-friendly attributes that we like. So my students, my challenge to them was, we tend to like these certain attributes more so than other attributes, and we think that we need to shield other people from those other attributes that might not be so likable. And yet, what does God say to us? He's revealing his glory, and what is he revealing about it? That even his judgment and his justice is his glory. And it brings him glory for that to be spoken about. The third component that Edwards talked about, worship. That God reveals his eminent glory to Moses, eminent as in king, worthy of worship, right? And what does Moses do? What is the only response that he can have after he sees God's glory? He falls down on his face and worships God. When you experience God's glory, the proper response is what? Worship. But it's not just for ourselves. It's not just to keep for ourselves. The fourth component Edwards talks about is what? That missional component, going out and sharing God's glory with other people. And so when you think about that, what does Moses do when he calls Moses to lead the Israelites? When he calls them to the promised land, and he calls them ultimately what? To proclaim God's glory. And they are his people so that they might reveal God's glory to the nations. And all the nations, he's established his covenant with them. Why? So that they might be able to show God's glory to all the nations, to proclaim that he is God alone. And so that fourth component of that missional component. So for Moses, this experience was enough for him to go despite his lack of credentials. He did not feel like he was the appropriate person to lead his nation. So much so, he said, I need help. And yet, what did he do? He led the nation, and he knew he could. Why? Because he had seen God. He knew God. He knew God's glory, and he knew that beyond anything else, that he needed to do whatever he needed to do in order to glorify God in that. So when you think about that, it's kind of remarkable that I think if I was having that question, so you remember what happened just before this passage? If you look back a little bit before this passage, what happens before this? Actually, what has the nation of Israel been doing? They've been committing idolatry. They've strayed from their true God. And so I think I would have asked a very different question than Moses going up on Mount Sinai. What would your questions have been, right? If you got God's ear unobstructed and got to say something to him, I think I would have said, why did you pick me? Or what am I supposed to do with these people? But what does he ask? The one thing he asks of God is, show me your glory. That's his main concern. I know that's not my main concern often, but thinking about, whenever you're fearful about your calling, what kind of questions should you be asking? Should you be asking, am I equipped? Can I actually do this? That question went through my mind today before chapel. As I shared with Dr. Arnold, I said, I'm not a speaker. That's my maiden name, but that's not my calling necessarily, right? I really see myself more as a dialoguer than a speech giver. And however, though, really the focus should be on God not on ourselves, and realizing that God's going to equip us to do what we're called to do. So going back to then our chief aim in life, thinking about those 4 components and how they tie together and really reflect that, is thinking that our chief and highest end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Or as the Reformers put it, sola Deo gloria, for the glory of God. And so having that, 1 Corinthians 10:31 puts it this way: whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. So those latter 2 dimensions of Edwards' dimensions of God's glory really give us a bit of a framework for figuring out how we do that. Our chief and highest end is to really bring God glory, because God is glorious. And how do we do that? We do that by worshiping God. We do that by sharing God's glory. So my eldest daughter, when she was just 7 years old, she's now 15, really helped put this in perspective for me one night. How do we actually do this? How do we actually glorify God? And when we used to live in Wheaton, and we had big trees there, something that I don't see as much around here. And we also have 2-story houses with big picture windows. And so in our bedroom in Wheaton, we had this big elm tree outside of our house. And we loved to watch the moonlight stream in our big picture window. And we'd like to watch the little shadow dance that would go on with the leaves. So something when fall that happens when you live in the Midwest is that you actually have leaves on a tree before they fall off that you can actually see, and you can see shadows on the walls. So one day we were sitting there watching the shadows dance on our walls, and my daughter said, and I said, "Don't you just love the moonlight?" And my 7-year-old daughter said, "You know, Mom, there's no such thing as moonlight." And I was like, "What do you mean there's no such thing?" My 4-year-old daughter said to her, "But Caroline, I see the moonlight. I can see it right there." She goes, "Actually, Ellie, it's just the sun. It's just the sun reflecting off the moon. So the moonlight isn't actually moonlight, it's sunlight reflecting off the moon." And I thought, wow, a 2nd grader is able to teach me a little bit from her science about God's glory. So we are more like the moon than we are like the sun. Our goal and our role in life as creatures created in the image of God is what? To image God. It's not to get that light out of ourselves, but it's actually to reflect God's light to other people. How do we do that? By coming close to God. We don't do it by trying to become perfect in our own power. We don't do it by trying to have the most knowledge about the Bible beyond anyone else. What we do is we draw close to God. Think back to Moses. When he came down from Mount Sinai, do you remember? He was so radiating light that what happened? The people couldn't even look at him. He had to have a face covering over him. So imagine you drawing close to God. God has torn that temple veil, allowed you in Jesus Christ to come close to him, to know his glory. Though we don't know the fullness of it, we never will fully experience God's glory because we're finite beings. However, he has given us his Son, the true Son. And he's enabled us to radiate God's light back to other people. And so, what is our true calling in life? To really image God. Not be God ourselves. That's the temptation that Satan gave to Adam and Eve, that we continually contend with. It is for us to image God, to reflect God, be like moonlight.
Biola University prepares Christians to think biblically about everything, from science to business to education and the arts. Learn more at biola.edu.